Well, dear colleagues, we start now working in our session group. So it is about the Irish history and culture in so-called Russian perception. Why we decided to put it in Russian perception? Because our speakers today, they will speak about those moments of Irish history or Irish literature in context of history, which can be most interesting, most significant for the Russian perception, for the Russian viewers and listeners and readers. So I'm honored to introduce the first speaker of our session today. We will go through historical perspective. So it's Dr. Damian Bracken from University College Cork in Cork. And I'm giving floor to Damian now, and he will speak about some moments of medieval Ireland and in the perspective I mentioned in the beginning. So Damian, you are very welcome.
Thanks, Andre. Thank you very much. I'm not sure what people are seeing at this time. Are you able to see the PowerPoint or?
Yes, PowerPoint.
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe you should switch slideshow. In this case, it will be slightly larger.
Okay, so if I go like this, is that better?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, fine. So what I'm going to talk about are early Irish perceptions of the land we now call Russia. But in the remote past, in the ancient world, it was not known as Russia, it was known in the West as Scythia. So from the perception of the ancient Romans from the time of the Roman Empire to the very northeast of the empire, there was a land of Scythia. And to the very northwest, there was another land, that was the land of Hibernia or of Ireland. And from a Roman perspective, both of these territories were inhabited by equally savage peoples. So the Irish were perceived as savage barbarians, not quite at the same level as the Russians or the Scythians, who were seen to be even more savage than the Irish themselves. And from an Irish perspective, what linked the Irish and the Scythians was not so much their barbarous nature as their names. The Latin name, one of the Latin names for Ireland is Scotia, and that from an Irish perspective corresponded to Scythia or Scythia. An Irishman was known as Scotus, and an inhabitant of Scythia as Scythus or as Scytus. And in Ireland's in the medieval Irish mythical historical tradition, that link was not so much at the level of the name, but at the level of the origins of the Irish peoples themselves. In those mythical histories, the Irish are descended from, well, one of the major figures in those mythical histories is a descendant of Noah. His name was Phineas Farsid, and he was the king of Scythia. And in those pseudo histories, in those mythical histories, Phineas journeys off from Scythia to the Tower of Babel, and he's in the Tower of Babel at a time when they're attempting to construct this tower, which reaches from the earth into the skies to reach heaven itself. And you know the story from the book of Genesis. And God isn't best pleased by this attempt to muscle in on his territory in the heavens. So he decides to cause chaos by creating not just one language, but 72 different languages to stop this enterprise to get into heaven by a shortcut. And what Phineas does is he goes around to each of those 72 different languages. He takes the best elements from those 72 languages. He puts all those 72 elements together and he produces the Irish language. And Phineas's son, the son of this mythical king of Scythia, journeys off into the west and he discovers Ireland. And it's from him, it's from Niall, the son of Phineas, that the Irish are descended. So according to these mythical accounts of Ireland's origins, the Irish are descended from the Scythians. So I send my greetings to all my long lost and distant cousins in Russia. some of those legends and some of those perceptions, some of those ancient perceptions of Scythia make it into other examples of early Irish literature. This is a folio from an Irish manuscript, probably not 7th or 8th. This is a 9th century, actually, a 9th century manuscript preserved in Munich, CLM 14429. And it is essentially, it's a word book. It's a list of every word the writer knew and an explanation of what those words mean. And it is a triumph of learning. This is someone who had gone to discover Hebrew names from a trawl through the great Jerome's explanation of Hebrew names, De Nominibus Hebraicus. And it has elements in there from the great world history of Orosius, other extracts from Isidore of Seville's etymologies. These are compendia which survive from the ancient world and here are being reused and repurposed by this Irish writer of the 8th or 9th century. And if you look here, you'll see where he gets to Scythia. Okay, and what follows is his account of Scythia and the Scythian people. And he says, like the country of the Goths, Scythia is said to have been named after Magog, the son of Japhet. So Japhet is Noah's son. So after Noah's mentioned in the Ark, is mentioned in the Bible in Genesis, Noah, the Ark of the Covenant, after the waters of the flood recede, Noah and the animals and his family emerged from the Ark, and one of his sons is Japhet. And according to these traditions, the peoples of Europe and the peoples of Scythia are descended from Japhet. He says, formerly, Scythia's territory was enormous and stretched from India in the east and from the Maeosian swamps in the north between the Danube and the ocean up to the borders of Germany. Scythia has many tribes in the west who are nomads because of the infertility of the soil. And from a Roman perspective, the nomads were the most savage of all barbarians. Civilization requires stability, and civilization from a Roman perspective requires an environment in which many people can cooperate in this collective enterprise of building up civilization. People, when they work together, can achieve much more than when they work on their own. And from a Roman perspective, the land of Scythia was vast and it was uninhabited and uninhabitable. So the people living in Scythia, they live by themselves. They live by themselves or they live in small isolated communities. They never come into contact with each other much. And if they don't come into contact, they can't build civilization. So from a Roman perspective, Scythia in the northwest and the northeast is a savage land, just as Hibernia, Ireland in the northwest was populated by savages. Scythia, this extract says, has many tribes in the west who are nomads because of the infertility of the soil. Among these tribes, some cultivate the land, whereas others, who are monstrous and savage, live on human flesh and blood. Many parts of Scythia have good land, but many are uninhabitable. For while many places in Scythia abound in gold and precious stones, they are rarely visited by humans because of the savagery of the griffins. And this reference here to the mythical beast, the griffin, it becomes almost a symbol in a sort of in the geography of the time. The griffin becomes a geographic code for Scythia and for the Scythian peoples, and in later times for Russia itself. And you might think that griffins are mythical beasts, these beasts that are made up of the body of a lion and the head of an eagle and the wings of an eagle. You might think these are mythical, these don't exist in reality, but the fact is I have seen these animals and I've seen them in St. Petersburg. I saw a group of 4 of them guarding a bridge in St. Petersburg. So that is what a griffin looks like if you're interested. If we move to an even earlier Irish source, this is a letter. It was composed about the middle of the 7th century by an Irish writer named Cummian. And Damian is perplexed because by this time, the Irish and the Irish Christians, he believes, are out of alignment with the general practices which have emerged in the Christian world generally. And to solve this problem, to see how the Irish are going to get their act together and come and realign themselves and their practices with the universal church, Damian records the sending of a mission from Ireland around the year 630. And that mission is sent to discover what are the practices of the universal church. And to discover this, this Irish delegation is sent off to the focus of the universal church. It's sent off to Rome. He says, when he's composing this, he compares the Irish to the universal church. And he says, these Irish and the British who are almost at the ends of the earth, and if I may say so, but pimples on the face of the earth. He's encouraging the Irish and the British to give up their particularism and fall into line with universal practices. Therefore, this Irish delegation goes from Ireland to Rome around the year 630. And if you're interested in Irish diplomatic history, or if you're interested in Irish diplomatic fact-finding missions, this is the earliest reference to this on record. He says this Irish mission, hence we sent those whom we know to be wise and humble as children to their mother. They arrived at Rome and returned to us in the 3rd year. So they reach Ireland, they go to Rome, they see how things are done there, and they return to Ireland. And he says, when they were in Rome, they told us after they returned, they were in one lodging in the church of St. Peter, with a Greek, with a Hebrew, with a Scythian, and an Egyptian at the same time at Easter, in which we differed by a whole month. And I would put money on it, but not much money on it, and say that this is possibly the earliest reference in the whole of Irish literature to the existence of Scythia, of Russia and the Russian people. And this Irish writer, far from seeing the Scythians and the land of Scythia as being irredeemably barbarian, this is an Irish writer who looks at the Scythians and he accepts them as members of he accepts their identity, not as savage barbarians, he accepts their Christian identity. So this is evidence of a European writer who views the people of Scythia on a very, very different way. He sees them as his fellow Christians within the global context of first of all, of learning and also of Christianity. So the Irish evidence shows that the Irish, as Andrei says, are interested in Scythia. They're interested in what we would now call Russia and the peoples of Russia. Sometimes they inherit these very chauvinistic and pejorative views of what the people in that part of the world look like and live like. But this is an example of what is, in effect, a very, very positive take on these peoples from an Irish perspective. So there's evidence here of the shaping of views and the shaping of identities from a range of different perspectives. The Irish are interested in the Russians because they see the Russians existing in the extreme northeast of the inhabitable earth, just as the Irish exist in the extreme northwest of the inhabitable earth, and there must be a connection. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Damian. It was very compact, but it was very bright and all essential. So interesting. Thank you so much. Dear colleagues, we now have our speakers talking about their themes, and later we'll have kind of 15 minutes for discussion and for answering questions. So now I pass the word to our second speaker in the session today. It's Dr. Tatьяна Иванова, Deputy Director of the Irish Cultural Center of St. Petersburg and President of St. Petersburg English Language Teachers Association. The floor is yours, Tatiana, please.
Yes, but I need to ask Damian to switch off his presentation because I need to load mine.
Yeah.
Thank you, Damian. Right, thank you. Yes, I'm going to speak about literature, and I will give a name to my presentation of Literature Encounters of Russian Perception of Great Irish Authors. And actually, we will start with the 18th century, as it was one of the most intensive periods of literature encounters and influence of Russian authors upon Russian literature and culture that continues in a way up to now. And we will divide between those famous Irish authors who lived and created their work in Ireland, such as Jonathan Swift, first of all, and Thomas More. But the list includes the authors of Irish origin who lived in England and sometimes historically were called Irish English or Anglo-Irish. And these were, among others, Lawrence Sterne and Oliver Goldsmith and Richard Brinsley Sheridan. As for Jonathan Swift, we all know that he was a dean in Dublin and in Patrick's Cathedral and was buried there. It's an interesting fact that actually there is a translation of the epitaph which is given on his grave. And you can see it here both in English and in Russian. To save time, I will not read all of it, but it is just a sign of respect to Swift among many others. An interesting fact is that Mikhail Lomonosov, who was a great Russian scientist, when he studied in Germany, he got acquainted with Swift texts and was fond of them. And as a result, in one of his books, which was called Brief Directions for Eloquence, if you translate it into English, or Краткое руководство к красноречию in Russian, he proclaimed that Swift was one of those authors who actually reads for moral purposes. He says that fiction might be classified into pure and mixed, and pure fiction consists of narration and actions that did not take place at all and is composed for some moral purposes. And maybe due to Lomonosov's contribution, maybe because of other things, books by Swift have been translated many times, and until now the interest to Swift is great, because a couple of years ago, when our Irish Cultural Center only started its functions in Herzen University, we were approached by one of the St. Petersburg schools and were asked specially to give a presentation on Swift and Gulliver's Travels. Another thing which which hasn't been proved yet, but I'm sure there is a connection, because Antioch Cantemir was lived almost the same time as Swift, and he was an envoy to a couple of European countries at different times, and had opportunity to read in English. And I'm sure that he was acquainted with Swift's work, and he is considered to be one of the first Russian satirists, and maybe it is just not a coincidence, but some logical connection. Swift was started to be published by Alexander Sumarokov in his almanac Трудолюбивая пчела in Russian, or Hard-Working Bee in English. And Sumarokov translated, didn't translate things himself, but he has chosen Swift as one of the authors that were important for his almanac. And in 1759, parts of The Tale of a Tub, translated by Rafay Karjavin, appeared. So first these parts, and then they were translated again. 18th century, Vissarion Belinsky is one of the authors that is quite prominent in the history of Russian literature. He was mostly critic and didn't write his own fiction, but he was very famous at that period, and his opinion was important for the whole literature elite of that time. And that is a quote from his papers, and he compares Swift, Voltaire, and Stern and considers their humorous stories that they represent the real 18th century novel. Turgenev, those of you who's interested in Russian literature must know him. He was quite a famous Russian author. He compares Swift and Saltykov-Shchedrin, or Saltykov as he calls him, and especially stresses the idea of serious and grim comedy, that realism, prosaic, and this lucidity amidst the wildest play of fancy, and above all, this constant good sense, the public, even when laughing, feeling itself under the lash. What is interesting, I have found this quote in English, but I couldn't find it in Russian because Turgenev wrote it abroad for an English magazine. So I haven't yet found it in translation. That is Saltykov-Shchedrin, so his portrait, and one of the most famous works by him is History of a Town, История одного города, and that is one of the things that Turgenev compared to Swift. Leo Tolstoy included the Gulliver's Travel into the list of essential books for peasant children. And here we have a little bit of a funny story, because yes, Swift books are still demonstrated in the mansion of Tolstoy in Yasnaya Polyana in his home library. But what is funny is that since Tolstoy included the Gulliver's Travel into the list of essential books for children, since then, in many situations, it was abridged and translated for children. There were several editions, and some people who are not very deep into knowing Swift as such, but know the translation, they consider him a writer for children. And in 1955, one of the professors of St. Petersburg, who worked at that time in Herzen University, in our university, he published a complete collection of Swift pamphlets. So Gulliver was the first, but then there were other works by Swift, and then this complete collection. So I will mention Stern, although in some sources he's considered to be an English writer, but since Belinsky compared them, I just started to have a look, and I realized that there was again a connection between Stern, who, from my point of view, although he did write his papers, his works, in England, he still remained a representative on Irish culture, because it was he who first introduced this idyllic image of the village, the love for village life, and also introduced a lot of a lot of humor into his novels. And as far as I could judge, Alexander Adishev, with his traveling from St. Petersburg to Moscow, and Nikolai Karamzin with Бедная Лиза, they had some influence from Stern. Pushkin valued Stern's satire a lot. He expressed it in one of his stories. Oliver Goldsmith was also a graduate from Trinity College, the same as Swift and Thomas More. And there is his monument by the same sculptor who did a monument to O'Connell. And there is Goldsmith's portraits to Reynolds. What is interesting that again, one of the novels, The Vicar of Wakefield, was translated quite early in 1846. I mean, early for that time. And since it was a lot of years after Goldsmith had died, but still the interest of Russian public to him existed, and that's why he was translated. And the interesting fact is that another work by Goldsmith, She Stoops to Conquer, was translated as Ночь ошибок, and the same title was taken for the film that was screened in 1974 by Mikhail Kazakov. And now we come to the most famous Irish poet, the Irish bard, as we call him, Thomas More. Andrei already said quite a lot of interesting things about him during his plenary, but I will just add, well, a little bit of things that have not been mentioned. So he got a Bachelor of Arts from the Trinity College when he was 19, and at the same year there was the uprising organized by United Irishmen, so Robert Emmet and others. But More was not taken to prison because he did not take any oath to the party and not participated in any armed uprisings. He only expressed his revolutionary feelings, and they were his friends. And to Emmet's sacrifice on the gallows, he pays homage in the song "O Breathe Not His Name." And he was one of the first writers who really proclaimed Irish identity and collected folklore, published songs and poems. The most famous books of his songs were Irish Melodies and National Melodies. And since to their melodic nature, they became very popular, and the themes were very dear to the hearts of many people. So nature and history of Ireland was together with memory, beauty, feelings, and time. And they were given tunes in many countries. And the song that Andrei mentioned has been so popular that some people in Russia still consider it a folk song and not, a song written by Moore. But those who know it actually start reading Moore's poetry and always enjoy it. The biggest poem, La La Roo, partly inspired by Lord Byron, according to some sources. This poem gave birth to a great number of adaptations, and when translated into Persian, became extremely popular in Iran. But it became popular in Russia almost immediately after its creation and presentation in Berlin. I didn't show it here. And it was so popular that future Russian Tsar family, future Nicholas I and his wife, participated in readings of the poem and created costumes for that. And later, in 1862, Anton Rubinstein composed Pheromones, a 3-act opera. The premiere was also in Berlin in 1863. And Thomas More also wrote biographies of Richard Brinsley Sheridan, and he was the first who named him an Irish satirist and playwright. And here we have, well, some things in Russian that were from Brockhaus and Euphron Encyclopedia, the translations from Sheridan, so quite a lot of them, and by Zinaida Vengerova, whom Andrei mentioned as well. And Moore and his poetry became a symbol and a motto for Celtic revival at the age of the 19th and 20th century, and William Butler Yeats and his circle of friends were inspired by Moore's poems and continued to develop ideas of national identity in Ireland and the Irish at a new level. And together with Yeats, I would like to mention John Millington Synge and Lady Augusta Gregory, who were his friends and well, brothers and sisters in arms, as we can say. And together they wrote plays for and promoted created an Irish National Theatre. And most of the plays have been translated into Russian, and some of them, including Theater of the Sorrows, The Playboy of the Western World, The Riders to the Sea, they all have been staged in Russia and gave the Russian readers opportunity to feel inspired by the romanticism and revolutionary ideas of Celtic revival. I will not speak more about Celtic revival because I know that Joseph ΟLiри is going to speak about it. But to sum up, I would like to stress the following, that the themes of Russian literature and Irish literature have a lot in common. The tradition of literature encounters goes back to old times, but is being developed now, and Irish and Russian literature encounters continue. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Again, it was compact, but it was very bright, and you really can see the panorama, how rich it was in the 18th century among all those writers and all those interconnections. And it's significant that you finish on the Celtic revival and mention John Synge and W.B. Yeats. So now I'm passing the word to Professor Joseph ΟLiри, who, as far as I know, wanted to speak about W.B. Yeats a little bit more as the most outstanding figure of that period, who inspired so much not only Irish poets and writers, but Russian poets and writers as well. Joseph, the floor is yours. Please switch on your microphone.
Thank you very much, Andrei. Since I last saw you, Dermot Kьоу has created a revolution in my life because he asked me to write an essay on the church and the hunger strikes of the 1920s. I went to the same school as Terence MacSweeney, the most famous hunger striker of all time, and perhaps the most successful. Now, I discovered that there is a Russian connection to this because the idea of hunger strikes entered British politics through the suffragettes, the first feminists. But they got their idea of having hunger strikes from the Russian prisoners of the Tsar in the 1880s. These prisoners had been treated badly when they were on hunger strike, and the British government had criticized the Russian government for this. So it was ironic that the suffragettes tried to expose the British government by provoking them to react in the same way as the Tsar had to the Russian hunger strikers. Where does Yeats come into that? Well, I'm just looking at a play which Yeats wrote in 1904, and which is about a hunger strike. A poet has been insulted by the king, and in Irish mythology or legend, the most terrible thing you can do is to insult a poet because you make the most dangerous enemy there is. And the poet has gone on hunger strike. I'll read you a few lines. He has chosen death, refusing to eat or drink, that he may bring disgrace upon me. This is the king speaking. For there is a custom, an old and foolish custom, that if a man be wronged or think that he is wronged, and starve upon another's threshold till he die, the common people for all time to come will raise a heavy cry against that threshold, even though it be the king's. Now, I'm not sure what prompted Yeats to write that poem, but it's true the history of hunger strikes has Irish roots. It was a mode of protest connected in, common in the Irish historical tradition. Now, our president Michael D. Higgins, had a wonderful event in Áras an Uachtaráin, which is the state residence, recently with the title Machnamh, which means reflection, contemplative reflection. And he is well aware that the forthcoming commemoration of the Irish Civil War, and before that, the War of Independence, is a dangerous event because Sinn Féin, who are quite strong in Irish politics today, want to use this commemoration to validate and to justify the IRA campaign in Northern Ireland, the so-called Troubles. So what the president did is he broadened the perspective on what's called the Irish Revolution. I have some doubts about that expression. He raised the perspective using the philosophy of Paul Ricoeur and of my friend Richard Carney, whom he quoted 3 times. Commemoration, which is not celebration, is a different thing. Commemoration becomes listening to all parties, hearing all their narratives, and bringing together a plurality of narratives. He spoke in a very idealistic way, but he had 3 or 4 other scholars by his side, and they filled out his picture beautifully. One woman talked about hearing the voices of women and children who were killed, people who were injured, both in the Civil War and the War of Independence, and also in Northern Ireland in the Troubles of 1969 to 1998. So it's a very different attitude to Irish history. When we celebrated the 50th centenary of 1916 in 1966, we celebrated, we didn't ask questions. There were 2 priests, an Augustinian called F.X. Martin and a Jesuit called Francis Shaw, who wrote essays, and they're the first revisionist essays coming from within Ireland, both of them criticizing the 1916 revolution very strongly, and even saying that it was a mistake. Those essays could not be published in 1966. The publication was delayed until after the death of Father Shaw, in one case. Nowadays, revisionism is everywhere. Irish history is no longer an unquestionable monolith. It's something very much open to question. One sign of that is a book by Roy Foster called Vivid Faces, quotation from Yeats's famous poem. I have met them at close of day coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among grey 18th century houses. And Roy Foster's take on the so-called Irish Revolution is quite startling. I have reviewed his book. I'm not sure I entirely agree with him, but he compares especially the revolutionary generation in Ireland with the revolutionary generation in Russia. He goes into things you would never expect. He even has a chapter on the sexual revolution in Ireland before 1916. Did you know there was such a thing? I certainly didn't. He says, an unexpected parallel between pre-revolutionary Dublin and St. Petersburg is sexual liberation. People ran away with each other to start communist communes in Donegal. Can you imagine that? By 1919, Rosamund Jacob, now she's a woman that becomes a hero in his account of the Irish Revolution. Most people in Ireland never heard of her, but he's coming as a Quaker, a very different background from most Irish people. Rosamund Jacob was enthusiastically reading Freud, Sigmund Freud, in 1918. She was a Waterford Quaker, and in 1931, she would report favorably on social conditions in the Soviet Union. Her diary reveals a devouring interest in young men. And then lesbian passion laced revolutionary activities in some cases, and so on. So this is a very different picture from the narrow militaristic image of Pearse's bloody sacrifice. What is the word he used? Blood sacrifice, a blood sacrifice. The Irish Revolution, as you know, is a very strange mix of hard military action and mystical ideas of sacrifice, which come from Catholic piety, from the devotional revolution of the previous century, and also come from ancient Irish mythology, Pearse's rewriting of the Cuchulainn story, and of course Yeats, his extremely powerful and effective plays about Ireland, image as a woman, Kathleen Houlihan, who is constantly calling on her sons to sacrifice themselves for her. Patrick Pearse also used that image of a woman in his very great poem, which is only 8 lines long. I am Ireland, older I than the witch of Beara. Great my glory, I who bore Cuchulainn the brave. Great my shame, my own children sold their mother. I am Ireland, lonelier I than witch of Beara. This is exactly a beautiful poem, but also a poem that sends people out to die. As Yeats himself said too, the certain lines of mine sent out some men the English shot. So Yeats was the most powerful poet of his time, and his poetry is immense, subtle, complicated, but there's enough powerful nationalist rhetoric to inspire people, just as Pearse was inspired. Or sorry, just as Pearse inspired people. Pearse being, of course, a much narrower and more fanatical person who wrote 2 or 3 great poems. So coming back to President Higgins' event, one of the speakers at that event was a Dutch scholar who said, we need an Aufhebung of the Irish Revolution in Hegel's sense of assuming it into a larger perspective. And he says we must place it in its times, the times of the crisis of empire, not only the British Empire, but the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire. They were all crumbling and collapsing. And we must put it against that wider background to learn its lessons and to assess it properly. Of course, the background to 1916, Easter 1916, was the First World War. And this is something that I think we haven't really sounded in depth. Pearse Pearse and the others in their proclamation of the Irish Republic, the founding document of Ireland today. Well, the founding document after our constitution, of course, but he called on our gallant allies in Europe, which meant the Germans. Ireland was betraying the British Empire, stabbing it in the back, as another Irish writer, Arthur Conan Doyle, said in his very last Sherlock Holmes story called His Last Case, which is an amazing story where we don't know who Sherlock Holmes is because he's in disguise and he's unmasking a German spy. Anyway, coming back to this idea of Aufhebung, of raising the Irish Revolution to this widest perspective. Perhaps there's a parallel in that case between Russia and Ireland, in that the pre-revolutionary generation was full of ideas, of genius, of inspiration. And then the revolution itself and its aftermath was disappointing, was very costly in terms of life and how many Irish talents were snuffed out, how much richer Irish society would have been if so many leading Irish leaders hadn't either died or killed themselves. Terence McSweeney was a very talented man, an extraordinary man, but he died at 46 in his hunger strike. And in the Civil War, there were 81 executions of leading figures, many of whom were very, very talented people. So this depleted.
Joseph, I apologize. We'll need to pass the word to the next speaker very soon, because otherwise we won't be in the frames for discussion.
Okay. In that case, I will quickly terminate. The big revisionist question is, should 1916 ever have happened? Was it a mistake? And this is a question Irish people are ready to entertain. Now, is the question Yeats entertained in his famous poem. Was it needless death after all? And the same question, of course, is obviously applied to the later Troubles, which Sinn Féin claims are the legitimate heir of 1916. There's a powerful book, which I'm just reading now, by Liam Kennedy, where he says bluntly that the Troubles were a disaster. The 1960s in Northern Ireland were a time of immense progress and progressive ideas, and everything was going well until the Provisional IRA started their 30-year campaign, which cost 5,000 lives and thousands of people injured and huge trauma throughout the province, but which also terminated all the progressive movements such as feminism, which had been flourishing before they took up arms. That's the end of my story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. It was, again, so much information, so rich with names, with quotations, with showing the picture from, you know, the most crucial moments like the Easter Rising, the Revolution, the Troubles. Thank you so much. It was really essential. And the last speaker today of our session, before we have a short discussion, is of course another expert in that period of the Irish Revolution and the Irish history of the 20th century, Professor Dermot Kьоу from University College Cork. Now, Dermot, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andre. I don't appear. Can you hear me?
Yes. Do you need me to show your posters, or you do it yourself?
Not until the end. I think towards the end, I'll just ask you to do it.
Okay. Okay.
I don't appear to be able to get my camera working, but that won't.
But we hear you very well. Yeah.
Very good. That's wonderful. Let me sort of try and pick up some of the things that our last speaker, Joe O'Leary, referred to, and in the context of 1919, 1921, quickly changed my text from the Irish independence or the Irish Revolution to the Irish independence movement. But let me begin. Many historians view the outcome of the Irish independence movement between 1916 and 23 as a victory for social conservatism and for the emergence of a state in which the Catholic Church wielded great power for nearly 70 years. But for those political leaders who led the 1916 Rising, it was a future filled with infinite possibilities. The struggle was against the British Empire, and amid the ruins of the German, Austrian, and Russian empires, Britain stood tall and strong. Irish revolutionaries confronted the British between 1919 and 1922 at a time when London felt supremely capable of putting down rebellions in India, Ireland, Egypt, and anywhere in the empire where they rose, where they showed their heads. Ireland, which formed an integral part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, was not a territory which London would readily relinquish, particularly at a time of its triumphant imperialism. And just let me say, in response to something Joe said there recently, that revolutionaries and the revolutionary generation of 1916, in confronting the British, certainly took aid and support from the German Empire, but as a small revolutionary movement, it was prepared, I think, to take support from any source, provided it could do damage to the British Empire. Ireland searched for allies wherever they could be found, and the Bolshevik victory was viewed in Ireland as a historical victory for anti-imperialism. That was particularly true in Irish trade union and labor circles, and the Bolsheviks provided a model of what was to be done, even if circumstances were to be different in Ireland. And when Britain challenged and opposed the Russian revolutionaries, that further enhanced the St. Petersburg Soviets' popularity in Ireland. Whilst most Irish workers had little idea how a Soviet worked, a few dozen came into existence in Ireland between 1919 and 1920, the Limerick Soviet of April 1919 taking the lead. Here was a revolution by imitation, springing from the British shooting of a local Irish leader, Robert Byrne, and the repressive aftermath, arrests and the imposition of travel passes to cross the Shannon River provoked the calling of a general strike by the local trade council, now calling itself a Soviet, and setting up committees to handle the distribution of food, finance, and publicity. The Soviet issued its own money, and its paper, called the Bulletin, the Workers' Bulletin, had in its masthead, issued by the Limerick proletariat. The Limerick Soviet permitted shops to open which sold food at prices recognized as fair, and they also confiscated or expropriated tons of grain on the Limerick docks. And in another Soviet, in Cleves Creamery in Knocklong, a banner displayed read, "Knocklong Soviet Creamery, we make butter, not profits." With little prospect of a national general strike, or indeed, in a sense, a general sort of workers' uprising, paralleling what had happened in Russia, the Soviets as a movement collapsed. But yet, at that stage, workers in Ireland were prepared to, in a sense, imagine themselves as being part of a wider international labor movement. In contrast, the leadership of Sinn Féin was most cautious. There were unfounded rumors in New York, as recalled by Dr. Patrick McCartan in his memoirs, that millions of rubles were being given to Dáil Éireann by Moscow. Alas, that was not true. Ironically, it was the Irish Republic that loaned some $20,000 to a Soviet representative in America in return for a section of what he described were the Russian crown jewels, and these were taken as collateral. Dr. McCartan, who I've mentioned, he was a leading Sinn Féiner, and he tried unsuccessfully in 1919 to persuade De Valera to give priority to seeking recognition from Moscow of the Irish Republic. But De Valera held the view that the first and primary objective of Irish diplomacy was to win recognition from the US. Besides, De Valera was very conscious that he had to protect the reputation of the Irish Revolution and prevent it from being stigmatized as a radical, socialist, and Bolshevik movement. As an undergraduate, many years ago, I read a book published in 1920 by the unionist Richard Dawson entitled Red, Terror and Green, the Sinn Féin Bolshevist Movement. The object of British propaganda at the time, and De Valera knew it well, was to present the Irish Revolution as part of a global anti-imperialist movement involving Bolsheviks, radical revolutionary Indian nationalists, Egyptian revolutionaries, and Islamic nationalists from different parts of the world, and heavily dependent on support from the Catholic Church and moderate democratic opinion in the United States. He was obliged to fight the British propaganda line in the Irish nationalist movement, and line that the Irish nationalist movement was part of a Bolshevik world conspiracy. The notion, of course, was absurd, but the popularity of the notion in the US would have been very damaging to Dáil Éireann in 1919, 1921. However, by early 1921, De Valera, having failed to get recognition of the Irish Republic from the United States, was prepared to send Dr. McCartan on a mission to Moscow. McCartan carried with him a draft treaty of Soviet recognition of the Irish Republic, and in his discussions in Moscow, McCartan had to combat the accurate perception that most Irish nationalists were hostile to communism and that the Irish struggle was not part of a world revolution. McCartan, of course, shifted the argument on to safer ground that the Irish were friendly to Russia because both had a common enemy, the British, trying at that time to overthrow the Soviet government. So when Moscow signed trade agreements with Britain, all hopes of recognition of the Irish Republic by Moscow faded. And in April 1921, the British seized a copy of the treaty that McCartan had taken to Moscow in a raid on a house in Dublin, and made public that document as proof that Irish nationalists were, in a sense, trying to work closely with the Bolsheviks. This was, of course, designed to discredit De Valera and Sinn Féin. As a footnote, Harry Boland, who had negotiated the loan to the Bolsheviks in New York in 1920, was killed during the Irish Civil War. The jewels wound up in the hands of his mother and were held later in safekeeping by her other son, Jerry, who was a minister in the Fianna Fáil government. And the story had an interesting ending because the jewels were valued at a certain point, and there was talk of putting them up to auction, but they were sold back to the Soviet Union or given back to the Soviet Union rather, when the $20,000 loan was paid in full but without interest. So that was the end of the Irish holding on to part of the what was allegedly crown jewels, Russian crown jewels. Now, if I move forward 10 years to 1932, when De Valera was elected president of the Executive Council, and he formed a minority government with the Labour Party, remaining in power until 1948. But in order to win the election, he had to fight against a campaign mounted by the outgoing government that his party was really a front for the Irish Republican Army, which had come under the controlling influence of Moscow and the international left. A government inquiry into the Irish Revolution left, the Irish Revolutionary left and its links with the Soviet Union had been tabled in 1931. And by all accounts, the Irish left in the 1920s was weak and communist affiliations limited. But when Garda's sources linked a new organization, Era, with the international left, that set alarm bells ringing in the Irish government, and the Irish writer Liam, there was a strong sort of left-wing influence, or at least interest in Ireland in the Bolshevik Revolution, and admiration for what was happening in Russia. But that was not shared by the Irish government of the day, the conservative Irish government of the day. And when De Valera, in a sense, fought that election in order to get into power, he was confronted by images which depicted him as being a communist. You could show those images if you have them now, Andre. Okay, so while Andre is doing that, I'll just sort of end up here. These are some of the, they're not very good, but you can see, I'm afraid they're terribly small. They can't be increased in size, I'd imagine, can they, Andre? No. But you have to take it on faith that these election posters present Fianna Fáil and present De Valera as a dupe of the IRA and as part of a revolutionary international left-wing conspiracy, which was, of course, patently absurd. But De Valera, having, in a sense, taken power and played a leading role in the League of Nations in the first 2 years that he was in power, he supported the admission of the Soviet Union into the League of Nations. So the rhetoric about the Soviet Union and the anti-communism in Ireland didn't prevent him from taking a decision on the basis of realpolitik that the Soviet Union should be part of the League of Nations as a counterweight to the growing influence of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. So throughout the 1930s, De Valera faced a rising chorus from opposition about the dangers of communism in Ireland. Although a strong Catholic, he faced down those alarmist claims, and no more so than during the Spanish Civil War, when he retained his recognition of the Republican government in Madrid until Franco had seized power in 1939. His bedrock principle was that diplomatic relations were between states and not governments. In the popular culture in Irish popular culture in the 30s and 40s, the Russian government or the Soviet government was seen very much in a negative light. And with the sort of emergence of the Cold War and the post-war period, the image of the Soviet Union in Ireland was tainted by the suggestion that it was trying to subvert Western Europe, etc. And of course, the Cold War presented huge problems for countries like Germany, or like France and Italy in particular, which had strong communist parties. But in Ireland, the Irish Communist Party would almost have fitted into an old-fashioned telephone box.
Dermot, I apologize. We need
and I'm finishing. The last sentence is that in my youth, I spent a great deal of time, at least being exhorted to pray for the conversion of Russia, invited to read stories about missionaries who were persecuted by the Chinese and by the Russians. It isn't until the 1960s and the early 70s that perspectives on the Soviet Union are clarified in Ireland and diplomatic relations are established in 1974. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dermot. So many connections, you know, in terms of the Irish politics of the revolutionary period in 20s and then 30s, and this description, though being so compact, is really bright. Now, dear friends, in 10 minutes, we'll have to come back to the plenary and to conclude the results of the work of the forum. So we have about 7-8 minutes really now to ask questions and to answer them. So I'm welcoming any questions or remarks about those 4 speeches, those 4 talks you heard, please. Joseph.
I reply to Tatjana. The very fascinating thing I came across lately is that Irish literature had an influence on Turgenev. Maria Edgeworth was a friend of Sir Walter Scott. And when Turgenev's brother visited Sir Walter Scott, he was very impressed by Maria Edgeworth and sent her stories to Turgenev, and they influenced Turgenev's breakthrough work, the sportman's sketches, or it's translated differently. But he said, I learned from Miss Edgeworth 2 things: to make the narrator a character in the story, and to adopt the point of view of the peasants, the peasantry. Interesting.
Tatjana, would you like to comment on it? Yeah.
Yeah, I just thank you for that. Actually, I didn't actually look into Turgenev's in particular, but it was one of the things that came up when I searched for Swift and Russian literature. But I'm sure that there is a lot of interesting things connected with Turgenev, because he lived in London many times, he lived all over the world, and he wrote tons of letters, we may say. And in these letters, he described his feelings, and his feelings not only about countries he visited, but also about literature. And I think that it is a big field for research in the future.
Thank you.
Thank
Now,
you.
welcoming any questions or remarks, either in voice or in chat, please. We still have some time for it. Colleagues. To any of 4 themes.
I just want to say thank you. I thought that was fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you,
all.
Kathleen. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you. Well, anything else? Any comments on what you heard from Damian, Joseph, Tatiana, or Dermot?
It was amazing. You know, Damian unfortunately has had to leave us for today, but I think it was amazing, this Griffin story.
Yes.
It was very impressive for me. And I think, well, I enjoyed well, listening to all our Irish participants, because in each talk there were a lot of interesting ideas and facts, and some of them that I haven't never heard of. And it is really, really important to know such things.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else, please? Any comments or any remarks? Okay, then we conclude. I want to say big thanks to our speakers today and to everyone who chose our session and came here and listened to those talks. We hope that this festival and our work will be prolonged, will be another stone in establishing this, you know, house of friendship and cross-cultural connection between Ireland and Russia. In fact, we hope with Elena Robertovna Yadrovskaya, the main organizer of this festival, that the festival on the whole and our forum today will be a step to establishing a permanent center of Russian studies in Ireland. And our Irish Cultural Center here in Russia will try to do as much as possible as soon as the pandemic is over. But even now, in virtual reality, we still continue those traditions. Heartily thanks to everyone. And now we need to switch off and to switch on back to the plenary to say some conclusion words.
There is a link in the